May 31, 1997. West State Street and Hinckley Avenue, Rockford, Illinois. Just before midnight, the street was loud with engines, summer heat, and young men watching each other too closely. Then, the shooting started. Not warning shots, not chaos without purpose, controlled bursts, fast, close, meant to answer an insult with a body. When it ended, the dead was not a gang chief, not a soldier, not a man built for that corner. It was 10-year-old Tanya Hooks. By morning, police would call it gang crossfire, another West Side tragedy, another city block claimed by Chicago's underworld. But that explanation was too small, because Tanya Hooks was not killed by one argument on one night. She was killed by a long war over what vice lord power in Rockford was supposed to be. One vision came from Bobby Gore, who helped build a disciplined machine that spoke the language of reform, politics, and community control. The other came from the age Willie Lloyd embodied, harder, more paranoid, more violent, built on fear, rank, and survival. Rockford did not simply inherit a gang problem, it inherited a divided kingdom. To understand Rockford, you have to understand that this was never just a street war. It was a struggle between two ideas of what vice lord power should be. Bobby Gore came first, older, smarter, more political. He emerged from Chicago's West Side as one of the most important faces of the conservative vice lords, a man who understood that raw force alone could not hold territory forever. He spoke to reporters, worked with community organizations, helped turn the vice lords into something that, at least in public, could claim discipline, structure, and legitimacy. In 1969, the conservative vice lords reached Rockford's Island Avenue, becoming the first major Chicago street organization to establish lasting ground there. That mattered, because Rockford did not receive chaos first. It received organization. Willie Lloyd belonged to a later and darker evolution. He rose through the unknown vice lords as a teenage recruiter, then built his name through prison, command, mythology, and fear. He called himself King of Kings. His authority was not built on reform language, it was built on rank, armed protection, retaliation, and survival. By the early 1990s, Lloyd was tied to kidnappings, internal vice lord war, and a campaign of counterstrikes that made leadership look less like governance and more like siege. That is why the title matters. Willie Lloyd versus Bobby Gore was not a literal duel across one city. It was something more important. Rockford became a battlefield between the old conservative vice lord model Bobby Gore helped symbolize and the harsher, fragmented, militarized vice lord world Willie Lloyd came to embody. One promised order, the other ruled through permanent war. And eventually, Rockford inherited both. Rockford was not conquered in one night. It was entered slowly. In 1969, the conservative vice lords settled onto Island Avenue on the city's west side, and that first foothold mattered more than it seemed. Rockford was still an industrial town then, factory whistles, shift changes, taverns glowing after dark. But beneath that working-class surface, there were already the conditions that make outside power travel well: segregation, neglected neighborhoods, shrinking opportunity, and young men looking for protection, income, and identity. The vice lords did not invent that vacuum. They learned how to occupy it. At first, the structure carried the old conservative language: order, rank, discipline, community presence. That was the Bobby Gore tradition at its most useful. A street organization that understood violence had to be managed, not merely unleashed. But cities change, industries collapse, and when Rockford's economic spine began to weaken, gang structure hardened with it. Corners became assets, housing projects became staging grounds, reputation became currency. By the early 1990s, Rockford was no longer dealing with one inherited branch. It was absorbing new vice lord factions and a more militarized logic. Insane vice lords, later Mafia insane vice lords, and other Chicago-connected sets entered a city already divided by turf and pressure. The old model of disciplined hierarchy was still there in memory, but on the street, fear was becoming more efficient than loyalty. The turning point came when Rockford stopped being a city of wages and became a city of vacancies. Factories closed, neighborhoods thinned out, storefront glass stayed dark longer. What had once been a disciplined foothold for the conservative vice lords on Island Avenue began to change under economic pressure and generational drift. In that kind of atmosphere, older rules do not disappear all at once. They rot, quietly, then suddenly. By the early 1990s, Rockford was no longer shaped only by the old conservative model associated with Bobby Gore's era. New Chicago factions were arriving, and with them came a harder code. The city's southwest side drew in Latin kings, four-corner hustlers, insane vice lords, and other aligned sets, all pressing into the same shrinking map, all fighting over corners, housing complexes, and narcotics flow. The language of leadership changed: less reform, less mediation, more rank, more retaliation, more suspicion. That was the real shadow of Willie Lloyd's time, not his personal command over Rockford, but the normalization of a style of street power built on armed loyalty and internal fracture. Once that shift took hold, every insult carried larger consequences. Every affiliation became a liability. Rockford was no longer just hosting imported organizations. It was becoming a pressure chamber. And inside pressure chambers, men do not simply defend territory. They begin to purge weakness. Rockford was not Chicago. That was the point. It was a factory city with deep conservative roots, a place that preferred order in public and pushed disorder out of sight. That made the arrival of the conservative vice lords in 1969 more than a gang expansion. It made it a political collision. On one side stood a city that wanted control through policing, zoning, and containment. On the other stood an organization descended from Bobby Gore's world, where power was not only measured in muscle, but in the ability to speak the language of legitimacy, community meetings, neighborhood influence, disciplined hierarchy, visible structure. For a time, that tension could be managed. The vice lords on Island Avenue were dangerous but recognizable. They had ranks, turf, internal logic. But as Rockford's economy weakened, politics hardened too. Officials no longer saw gangs as something to contain socially. They saw them as permanent enemy infrastructure. That changed the streets. Every police sweep made neighborhoods feel occupied. Every arrest fractured old chains of command. And every fracture opened the door for younger factions who respected force more than diplomacy. That was the deeper escalation. Not simply more crime, more ideology. The Bobby Gore model depended on controlled power and public posture. The later style that men like Willie Lloyd came to symbolize thrived under siege. The more pressure the system applied, the more street leadership turned inward, suspicious, and absolute. By the mid-1990s, Rockford's gang map no longer looked stable. It looked nervous. Sets were no longer just fighting rivals. They were watching each other. Old affiliations blurred. Younger factions shifted names, switched loyalties, or rebranded under stronger banners. In Rockford, even the vice lord presence was fragmenting. Insane vice lords gave way to Mafia insane vice lords. New allied groups appeared on the southwest side. What had once been a recognizable hierarchy was becoming a room full of armed men speaking the same language of power, but no longer trusting the same chain of command. Source: that is how isolation begins in organized crime. Not with exile, with uncertainty. The Bobby Gore tradition had depended on structure that could hold men together. But the later street culture associated with Willie Lloyd's era taught something harsher. When pressure rises, survival belongs to whoever can anticipate betrayal first. Lloyd himself had lived inside that logic, surrounded by bodyguards, hunted by rivals, and locked in internal vice lord conflict so deep that even his own side could become a threat. Rockford absorbed that mentality without needing Lloyd in the room. On corners, in projects, in parked cars with engines idling, every stare lasted too long. Every rumor felt actionable. Every small dispute risked becoming proof that someone had chosen a side. And once men begin living like betrayal is inevitable, violence stops being a reaction. It becomes a precaution. It happened the way these killings often happen in cities that have lived too long with organized street power. Fast, loud, then permanent. On the night of May 31st, 1997, the intersection of West State Street and Hinckley Avenue had already become one of those places where everybody understood the rules without speaking them. Cars slowed for no reason. Faces were checked through windshields. Corners were not just corners. They were declarations. By then, Rockford's west side was carrying years of accumulated pressure. Vice lords, allied factions, gangster disciples, shifting loyalties, and the constant fear that hesitation looked like weakness. Then came the gunfire. Not the wild sound of panic, something colder, retaliatory, deliberate enough to send a message, reckless enough to hit whoever happened to be standing inside the message's path. The target was gang opposition. The victim was 10-year-old Tanya Hooks, killed in the crossfire of a dispute between gangster disciples and vice lords. In official language, it was another tragic bystander death. But in the language of the street, it was the inevitable end of a system that had already accepted public space as a battlefield. That is why this moment matters, because Tanya Hooks was not killed only by the men who pulled triggers that night. She was killed by the long collapse of internal restraint, by the death of hierarchy, by the replacement of old, disciplined command with splintered crews trying to prove they still mattered. The Bobby Gore era had sold a theory of control, even if imperfect, even if compromised. The Willie Lloyd era symbolized something far harsher: survival through armed supremacy, constant suspicion, and retaliation before vulnerability could spread. Rockford had absorbed both traditions. By 1997, what remained was the shell of order and the full machinery of fear. So no, Tanya Hooks was not the intended target. But she was the clearest proof of what the war had become. When organized crime loses its internal discipline, it does not merely kill rivals. It begins to execute the neighborhood around them. After Tanya Hooks was killed, Rockford did what American cities always do after a child dies in gang crossfire. It spoke in two voices. The public voice was grief, candles, news cameras, police statements, adults standing on porches in the humid dark, speaking softly about innocence, about how it should never have happened, about how the city had gone too far. But the private voice, the one that mattered on the street, was calculation. Who fired first? Who answered? Who looked weak? Who had to answer next? That is the terrible arithmetic of organized crime. Even after a child is buried, the machine keeps counting, and Rockford was now trapped inside a problem much older than the shooting itself. The vice lords who first came into the city in 1969 had arrived with hierarchy and a recognizable command structure. That structure carried the shadow of Bobby Gore's political style: discipline, organization, the possibility, real or performed, of internal control. But by the 1990s, Rockford was dealing with something more fragmented, more suspicious, more militarized. Factions had shifted, old names had split. New Chicago-connected crews had entered a city already hollowed out by industrial decline. The result was not order. It was armed instability. That is the fallout most people miss. The death of Tanya Hooks was not just a tragedy. It was a public revelation. It showed that the old promise of controlled street governance had failed. Whatever the vice lords once claimed to be, community power, disciplined reformers, protectors of neglected blocks, that image had collapsed under the weight of turf logic and retaliatory violence. And the harder worldview symbolized by Willie Lloyd's era had no answer either. It could dominate men, it could inspire fear, but it could not prevent the war from consuming the civilians living inside it. So the fallout spread outward, not only through arrests or headlines, but through memory. Parents changed routes home. Children learned which corners to avoid. Entire neighborhoods began to understand that they were no longer near the conflict. They were inside it. In the end, the story returns to that street in Rockford on May 31st, 1997. The heat, the corner, the waiting, the gunfire. a child dead in a war she did not start and could not understand. That is where all organized crime stories eventually arrive when you strip away the mythology. Not at the throne, not at the ceremony of rank, not at the whispered language of kings, chiefs, or nations. They arrive at the ordinary street, where power proves what it really is by what it destroys. What this case reveals is simple and brutal. Organized crime does not merely grow from poverty, it grows from absence. The absence of order people trust. The absence of institutions that can protect a neighborhood without humiliating it. The absence of work that gives young men status without bloodshed. In that void, gangs do what mafias have always done. They imitate the state. They create ranks, codes, punishments, territories, and systems of belonging. Bobby Gore understood that earlier than most. His generation of vice lord leadership saw that force alone was too unstable. Power had to look moral, political, almost legitimate. That was the promise of the conservative vice lord model at its most sophisticated. Not the end of violence, but the management of it through structure. But that promise carried a lie inside it. Because once an organization learns that fear works faster than consent, the temptation is permanent. Willie Lloyd's rise represented that darker truth. His authority was forged through prison, armed protection, retaliation, internal war, and the belief that leadership existed to survive siege at any cost. Even when men like Lloyd spoke of hierarchy, discipline, and command, the engine underneath was increasingly paranoia. And paranoia can build empires for a while. It can terrify rivals. It can produce obedience. But it cannot produce peace, because it reads every weakness as betrayal waiting to happen. That is why Rockford matters. It was not simply a smaller Chicago. It was a place that inherited two different models of street power at once. One model said the gang could become a disciplined political force. The other said survival belonged to whoever struck first, purged fastest, and ruled through permanent readiness. In practice, both models fed the same machine. One gave it public language, the other gave it military logic. And when economic collapse hollowed out the city, when factories closed and neighborhoods were left to absorb the pressure alone, the distinction between those two visions began to narrow. What remained was territory, memory, and the reflex to answer fear with spectacle. That is the deepest tragedy of organized crime. Publicly, it speaks the language of protection. Privately, it feeds on exposure. It tells a neglected neighborhood that it will defend it from chaos, then quietly teaches that same neighborhood to live inside chaos as a daily condition. It promises belonging, then makes belonging contingent on violence. It offers young men identity, then converts identity into debt. By the time a child like Tanya Hooks is killed, the system has already completed its work. The neighborhood has been trained to expect grief as weather. So the final lesson is not that one side was pure and the other was evil. It is worse than that. It is that organized crime becomes most dangerous precisely when it starts to resemble order. Because then people can mistake hierarchy for stability, ceremony for legitimacy, discipline for morality. But the measure of any power structure is not how grandly it names itself. It is what lies in the street after the gunfire stops. And in Rockford, after the kings and the doctrines and the inherited wars, what lay in the street was a 10-year-old girl. That is how these kingdoms end. Not with victory, with a child's name surviving longer than the men who claimed to rule.